Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Kyle.
I'm Hayley.
I'm Nina.
I'm Jordan.
And you can find show notes and more about our podcast at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. You can share and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And on our website, alienfamiliar.com, we have all sorts of useful links, including links to Jordan's Apocalyptia, where you can find it on DriveThruRPG. Version 2.0 is out now. And our topic for today, we are going to be talking about, just in general, the fantasy genre. Kind of what is and is not fantasy, and what is needed to make a fantasy game. And I kind of want to open it up with, because everybody kind of seems to have their own opinion as to what is and is not fantasy. For some people, fantasy is only set in a medieval time or earlier. For other people, Star Wars is absolutely fantasy and it is not sci-fi. So I kind of want to find out from everybody here kind of what they feel is and is not fantasy. What is needed to have a fantasy, and what are some of the tropes that you commonly associate with fantasy?
I think it's really interesting that you bring up Star Wars right off the bat, because I know a lot of people classify it as sci-fi. I personally classify it as fantasy because sci-fi is science fiction where it takes fact, and fiction where fantasy takes fiction to fiction. So I think it's very important, at least in my mind, to separate those two. So when we talk about fantasy, it's talking about more imaginative and creative ways to reason things for a world, whereas sci-fi talks about taking factual parts of a universe and adding new logic to it for that world.
I think that is a partially true argument, but a little bit oversimplified, maybe? Only because I know that a very common thing, and one thing I like about sci-fi, common thing to analyze when looking at sci-fi is its tendency to take something happening in present day, whether it be a new technological development, political unrest, social movement, and take it to the extreme. Years in the future, this has become a dominant thing, and look at our present day lives through this lens. I think that itself, what I just said, is also an oversimplification of sci-fi, but it's also not the only thing that sci-fi does. I think that to look at fantasy as none of this is factual, it is purely fiction, it's all made up, is not entirely true.
I agree. I think there's better ways I could phrase what I mean. And I agree with your statements. I think you've explained it better than I could have. What I'm saying is that where sci-fi starts with a base of facts, fantasy starts with a base of creativity that then reason is applied to it.
So sci-fi isn't creative for you.
I'm just digging myself into a grave. I'm just saying, somebody else speak, please.
What do you consider fantasy, Jordan?
Fantasy, in my opinion, is the type of fiction that doesn't particularly care about being self-referentially coherent. The rules in fantasy are pretty loose. You can always just kind of wave your hands and say, well, because of magic. And there is that in sci-fi to an extent. I mean, the old bounce it off the deflector dish trope from Star Trek.
Faster than light travel. It's just, don't talk about it. It just exists.
Right, but it asks less of you to just go ahead and accept, here's a couple of foundational breakthrough technologies that we don't have right now. That's the reason that it's not a modern thing. And then everything else is kind of expected to work at least within its own rules. Whereas fantasy stuff, at any time you can come across a wizard who's got some spell that does some crazy thing that you never heard of, or an artifact that does the same. It's a lot more wide open. That's what separates the two in my mind anyway. One of the things.
And that does back up what you were saying, Hayley, about sci-fi having typically nuggets of cohesion or truth to it, with mango habanero dipping sauce for the nuggets.
Why are you like this?
I like mango habanero dipping sauce. Is that a problem?
Sounds really good.
Okay, anyway.
The dichotomy between fantasy and sci-fi, to me, falls in what Hayley was talking about and Kyle was talking about for something that is purely made up versus something that is based on something in fact. So I very broadly categorize most things that are in popular media now as fantasy. To just go right down the line, since I brought up Star Wars, I will identify what is sci-fi in Star Wars and what is fantasy in Star Wars. What is fantasy in Star Wars? Long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. That is how fairy tales begin. So right off the bat, opening crawl of the original Star Wars, you're being told that this is a fantasy. Mm-hmm. There are sci-fi elements to it, but I feel like there really aren't that many sci-fi elements to it. The elements would be the androids walking around that operate on knowable laws. The Jedi, however, and the Force and all of that, until it was ruined, did not operate on...
Midichlorians.
Yes. Did not operate on any sort of known laws. It was something that you felt. It was something that you had an emotional, spiritual connection to. And that is, to me, what good fantasy is that fantasy speaks to that emotional, spiritual level in some way. Whether it's tackling morality, whether it is just telling a romping story, it always seems to go down to having that core to it.
Do you think sci-fi doesn't?
No, I think the sci-fi does do it, in that goes back to everything has a little bit of fantasy in it. The core of sci-fi to me is in its basis in reality, taking something that we have now and taking it to an extreme, or taking it to what the author believes is a predictable point, and the human stories arise out of that, and the human stories are just a way of relating to the world, grounding yourself into the world in which, like, some sort of advanced technology is required in order to tell a story.
I think you might be onto something there with human stories. I just air quoted. I lean more towards sci-fi in my liking of fiction. And one reason for that is that it takes whatever question you can think of, or advance or dilemma you can think of, and it takes it as far in the future or as far to a different galaxy or time as you want to go, but it maintains this is how a human might navigate that. Whereas a lot of fantasy tends to incorporate ways of thinking or species or fairy tale fantasy tropes that don't necessarily have to be this is how a human deals with that, and that's not where the story sort of spawns from. What do you guys think?
I think of Star Trek and how Star Trek is sci-fi because even whenever they're tackling social issues, they are tackling something that is present, that it is something that is real in the real world, and they're taking it to a point where the author thinks it can go in the future and telling a story using that. Something that would be fantasy, like, for instance, Game of Thrones. Very definitely fantasy. I don't see a lot of real-world parallels of what we are experiencing now in what's happening in Game of Thrones. I know that, from what I've read, George R.R. Martin based a lot of the story of Game of Thrones on the War of the Roses. Mm-hmm. Again, that's hearkening back to something from the past, telling a familiar story in some way, even if it is changed to the point where it's nearly unrecognizable.
A question.
Is it related? Because I have a thought that directly spins off of that.
It's related, but I think yours is going to be more related.
Sidebar about Game of Thrones, that is one reason why I really enjoyed Game of Thrones, the books anyway. I haven't watched too much of the series.
It's really good.
It is the granularity with which it tells its stories, character level especially. Even though it is based, I didn't actually know it was based on War of the Roses. That's cool.
I don't know if that's a fact. That's just
something
I read.
Sorry, I read a lot of everything.
Even though it is based on a historical war, and I think it does a great job of as George R.R. can interpret it, telling what a human story might be like in that time, plus some dragons and some old magic that, kind of comes into existence finally after everybody thought it was gone. For some reason, to me, I don't know, the character and human stories there feel more relatable and believable than something like Tolkien's works, which I also really like. It's harder for me to, I guess, identify with, maybe? If that makes any sense?
Yeah.
The thing I was going to bring up was about how you had mentioned how sci-fi is taking something and bringing it to the extreme in the future tense, while fantasy often relies on basing itself off of something from the past and expanding on it. Do you think that it is part of the trope to only have a future relate to sci-fi and past relate to fantasy, or is that just something that happens to happen a lot? Because I know that you can have urban fantasy, but I haven't heard a lot about past tense sci-fi.
I think yes to both of those extremes, because in Star Trek, Q is God.
Yeah, Q is God.
There's no other way of describing it. Just describing that character and that continuum of characters. And on the sci-fi end, retro sci-fi is huge. Steampunk, dieselpunk.
That's what I was going to ask. Isn't steampunk just
See, I don't know.
sci-fi?
It's kind of like fantasy. The fantasy of, what if this world was like that? What if... I mean, it's, on the border. If fantasy and sci-fi was a spectrum, it would be, leaning sci-fi, but I feel like it'd be in the middle. I don't know. I just want it all.
Wholeheartedly consider steampunk sci-fi.
I think sci-fi and fantasy are two different axes. Because you can have really far sci-fi and really high in the sci-fi and also really high in the fantasy. Oh, what was it? The Foundation series? Asimov?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's set in, so far in the future that it might as well be a complete fantasy.
Still, at the same time, though, it's not... the real split between the two, to me, is the supernatural, and by that I mean specifically magic. In sci-fi, even if you're talking about something as outrageous as Q or any of the other really powerful Star Trek aliens, there's always kind of a hint that they're super powerful. They're wildly more powerful than us, and we have no way of comprehending what it is. But it's always kind of presumed that there is something that makes sense about it. What's the guy, the Traveler, that Wesley Crusher meets? He kind of touches on that a little bit, how there's just all this other stuff to reality that we just haven't figured out yet. And Q says some similar suggestive kinds of things. But there's always a hint that there's an objective reality, whether or not we get all of it. With fantasy stuff, it's all based in the occult. It's all this stuff from, the netherworld, the astral plane, whatever, that we can kind of mess with a little bit, but we're mostly victims of. And there's very little hope that, humans will ever be able to deal with that. I don't know, sci-fi seems a lot more optimistic as far as the trajectory of human progress. That's kind of its foundations. Whereas fantasy, it always feels to me like it's more like a survival thing. We're prairie dogs trying to hide in our holes when the dragon swoops over, or, figure out how to not be completely crushed under heel by the wizard or what have you.
The counter I will posit to that is Harry Potter. Yep. It's a very optimistic story that's set in the fantasy realm.
It's about killing people that aren't wizards, and everyone dies, and it's really sad.
It's a very optimistic story of overcoming Nazis, wizard Nazis. They're gone by the end of the storyline, basically.
Well, they're there.
I think one thing that makes Harry Potter solidly fantasy is just like what you just said, Jordan. In Harry Potter, or just about any other fantasy thing I can think of, either you have it or you don't.
Oh, I wasn't claiming it wasn't fantasy.
Oh, no, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I'm just spinning off points.
Okay.
No, I agree with you. And also in that it is a very optimistic, overcoming Nazis story. But in fantasy, Either you have it or you don't. You're either a rando human that will never have access to these supernatural abilities or powers, or you have them to some degree. And in sci-fi, I think that is a very common theme that might make it seem possibly more optimistic at first glance, is that even something like the Q or those first episode of Star Trek Next Generation, the encounter at Farpoint, those wacky giant space octopi squid things made of light, all of these things that are crazy and might be fantasy, within the context of that reality, that could be something that humans might someday evolve to. Beings of energy, beings of light, being a common end of the evolutionary spectrum and beginning of another spectrum jumping off from there. There's always that chance that through study or through time, you might achieve those powers, whatever they may be. Whereas fantasy definitely segregates it.
This is not an original thought of mine, but is something that I'm reminded of. Somebody categorized fantasy and sci-fi into two very simplistic terms. Fantasy is regressive, sci-fi is progressive. Regressive being looking back to the past, no matter how the past actually was, but looking back and seeing, well, there was like very set, rigid tiers of people, and that's how it was, and look at how great things were back then. Whereas the more Whereas like the more progressive sci-fi is more looking toward, this is a possible future where, again, grossly oversimplifying, but people have the ability to become more. Whether they are fighting to have more against a mega corporation, or whether it is a futuristic utopia where people do have all of their needs met and are free to engage themselves in the pursuit of just going out and exploring the cosmos.
What are your guys' thoughts on, spinning right off along these lines, sci-fi portraying stories where there is a baseline adoption, or if not adoption, at least knowledge and awareness of many things that allow a larger networked community, be they faster than light travel or radio communication. You might, there's a lot of, look at Tatooine, those people have next to nothing, but everybody knows there are starships and FTL and communicators and all sorts of things, moisture collectors. Whereas I think in fantasy, a lot of stories there might focus on, I'm a simple farm guy, and holy shit, there's magic. I didn't know about that at all.
I think that's an oversimplification of the concept of fantasy, because most of the fantasy that I read is urban fantasy. Like, the only one that I've read that takes place in, like, I'm a farm boy, would be Tolkien.
I've read a lot of urban fantasy, and Farm Boy was a poor choice.
No, I know, but the concept, like, the only one that I find that fits that is Tolkien and, like, the Hobbits and stuff like that. Like, everything I read is urban fantasy. They know about magic.
Everyone in the city knows about magic.
No, but there's a
don't.
Well, yeah, but there is a community in it. I'd find that it, like, the only one that I think of that can focus on somebody that finds magic is Harry Potter, which I keep going back to, but it's only because I know much about it.
I think something that like branches both of those ideologies is the thing that sci-fi has this very much explored open universe where if you're playing specifically like an RPG, for example, like everybody knows this lore, everybody knows what's going on in the universe, and you get to go and discover it as it's already been laid out for you. Whereas in fantasy, specifically in an RPG setting, you're mostly like in a small town, or you're with a tavern or an adventurers guild, and you go along and discover things as with the world rather than discover things in the world. So for example, like you're playing a bunch of humans and you discover that you have magical abilities and stuff. You're discovering the possibilities of this world as it's being created. Where sci-fi things have already been brought to this extreme, there's already like so much of it done where I feel like fantasy is the act of creating it.
Hayley, you may have explained what I was trying to say better than I explained it. Savor that. That's your one.
Thanks. It's my redemption for my really shitty opening to this podcast.
Now I'm about to talk about something that I know next to nothing about, but I think it's a very good example of urban fantasy being the Dresden Files.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were several of those.
Because I've not yet been able to read the books. I have the first trilogy at home.
For a man who wears a chapeau, you should definitely read them.
They're so good.
So I've heard.
My ex-roommate, Jenny, is, like, obsessed with the Dresden Files. Like, I think she's getting, like, a tattoo.
You can call her your friend.
Well, she is my friend, but I know her exclusively because I lived with her.
So
I am friends with one
our
person
listeners
named
don't
Jenny.
really need
They
to
don't
know
care.
her.
Oh, wow.
Sorry, but
I have friends, listeners. They exist. Care about them.
I think you're just making this all up. I think it's your fantasy.
Please tell us
Yep.
about Jenny, your imaginary friend.
Wow, well, my imaginary ex-roommate, Jenny, she is obsessed with the Dresden Files, and often she would try to explain it to me, and I know very little about it, but basically it's like this really interesting, like, urban fantasy world, where things are really dark and sad, and cogs speak, I think.
Okay, so,
I want to let someone who's read the
KP,
book.
would you like to talk about the Dresden Files?
Well, Clayton, all of you are probably going to cut all of that. Go ahead and talk about the Dresden Files, what you were going to say.
I was actually going to open up to somebody who has actually read the series, because I only know what I have heard about the Dresden Files, and what I have heard about the Dresden Files is it still follows the regressive ideology of there are these groups who inherently have these abilities that other people will never be able to get.
Castes or
All the different
classes of society, different
Right.
societies interacting.
and there's no way to really bridge from one group into the other.
And that is why Dresden's a cool character for me. Is he, obviously for literary sake and for the reader's sake, but also within his characterization in the story, he is that bridge. And he often deals, and maybe I'm wrong, I've read a decent amount of urban fantasy, but probably not the same series you have, Nina. It seems to me that in the ones I've read, there's a very common trope of your average human doesn't know anything about this. It's the veil. It's the big enigma. And I, the character, will tell you all about this crazy thing that is right underneath your nose. In Dresden's case, he is this noir detective who takes odd jobs and is one of the only magic users, and indeed people aware of these other worlds and societies and beings, that openly in newspapers puts out ads saying, "You need supernatural help, Chief? Come to me. I have an office. I have an old wooden desk with scotch on it, because I'm a detective." And there are rules that your average human won't understand. There are a few, like, police officers that Dresden works with who knows he's into some wacky shit, but they don't want to know. They just don't think about it. They don't deal with it. They know it's there. They don't care about it. They're just there to be a cop. And
Don't think about it, Morty.
Rick and Morty, sci-fi or fantasy, guys?
Sci-fi?
Finish. I'm so sorry.
I mean, I'm trying to think of how. So I guess that there's one way I just mentioned that the Dresden Files is or could be regressive. Is that a lot of the surface polish in that series, even though it's set in ostensibly present day, harkens back at least to like 1940s era. Dresden openly has a very sort of classic chivalry view towards women. And he admits it, and he's like, a lot of people don't like that I do it. I know about it, but it's what I do. There are, tropes you see in 40s movies and TV, but more than that, this idea that your average human, your average wealthy executive on Wall Street, the elite of our society now, is really just in the lowest caste of the low, because they don't know shit about vampires. They don't know shit about magic talking skulls named Bob. I guess that is their big core of the series. And then the other urban fantasy stuff I've read too, that humans need to be protected sort of a thing.
I think I did misunderstand you at first. And also I'm very, I've discovered just now I'm very protective of fantasy, and the way you've been painting it is like this bleak storyline where it's regressive and, you know, we're victims of it. Like, I think I just got really defensive there for a hot second.
Tell us about your tales of optimism then.
Regressive doesn't necessarily mean bad.
Oh, I know.
Because it is hearkening back to a time when things were better.
I know.
And progressive doesn't necessarily mean good and shiny. I can think of plenty of dark sci-fi.
Sure.
In the grim world of Warhammer 40k, there is only war.
So I'm going to change the title of this episode to Sci-Fi versus Fantasy.
Because you can't like both.
I don't know what you expected with KP here. Like,
I didn't even know this was our topic today.
Christ.
My gloves are always just at arm's reach to strap on and duke it out for sci-fi.
I have a
Strap on.
question. What?
What?
I have a question. Books like The Giver and Handmaid's Tale and stuff like that. Fuck you.
No. Nothing at all with what you're saying. I just recalled that when I was a child, I thought it was... I saw the book in like the book ordering things we got, and I thought it was pronounced... I thought it was the Guyver.
No.
Like-
You did that too?
Oh my god! Oh, thank Jesus!
You're not alone.
I was the Guyver for a long time. I'm sorry.
I didn't
I'm
know
sorry.
that The Giver
Would
was
you-
fantasy. I always assumed it was about
Hi,
Nazis, and
hi,
that's why I never
hi.
read it.
Let me ask my question.
Okay.
Would you consider books like The Giver and Handmaid's Tale sci-fi or fantasy?
I consider them horror.
Oh!
They scare me.
Well!
They scare me.
They're not meant to be. Well,
well,
Handmaid's Tale. I'm sorry.
well. Yeah.
But like, I
Margaret
don't know,
Atwood.
they walk the line, I think.
I haven't read Handmaid's Tale. I know the sort of story, but I don't know enough to talk about that one.
Well, I read it in 6th grade, and I would not be able
You
to...
read it in the 6th grade?
I would not be able to accurately tell you. Because 6th grade. It's been a while.
On what I've read, Ulse by Margaret Atwood, I'd probably say she leans more towards the fantasy side.
I've called it sci-fi.
Yeah, I think it's dystopian sci-fi.
Yep.
It's just
The Giver as
all
well, or
over
just
scary.
Handmaid's Tale?
I don't know much about The Giver.
I'm not familiar either.
I thought The Giver was about Nazis.
That's a
A lot of
stretch.
things about Nazis.
That's a stretch, but like not as much of a one as you would expect.
In The Giver and Gathering Blue, I forget if that's a sequel or a prequel, but same author. I'm pretty sure same author.
Yes.
Handmaid's Tale, it's stories like that. Is it true that these seemingly godlike powers that the elite have, those end up being explained and their towers come crashing down when people realize, right, that these are things that are just they're keeping this from us.
Yes.
That's kind of the
Yeah.
core of it.
Yeah,
right?
but that's because they're both dystopian. Like, I feel like that's more of a facet of the dystopia than it is about sci-fi versus fantasy. It could be neither, the thing is. Like, I was just curious because I found every time I read those, or books like them, they walk the line, and it's very... There's aspects of sci-fi, i.e. like advanced technology and stuff like that, but in The Giver, the book starts out with nobody's able to see color. Like, it's just all in black and white. And that's not that, or, well, it's kind of explained. But not through science, so. But there are, like, scientific advances in that book, and I don't know, it walks the line, I was just curious. The Giver's on my mind a lot.
Do you think dystopias can only be in sci-fi? Because I'm trying to think of any fantasy dystopias, and I can't really think of any.
I would like to kind of focus just... I think we've argued to an impasse about sci-fi versus fantasy.
Yeah,
so right now I want to
sorry.
shift specifically to fantasy tropes because I definitely want to tackle sci-fi, and in particular I want to devote a whole episode to dystopia sci-fi.
Okay, cool. We can shelve it.
Well,
Bring up Handmaid's Tale then again.
Ooh, maybe we can watch it.
one thing that kind of cracks me up with fantasy, be it movies or books or games that have come out really just in the last like 10 or 15 years maybe, is how the creators have to try to bend over backwards to make it, to sort of shoehorn in modern progressive humanist values into the stories that they're telling a lot of times, when the truth of the matter is that the entire genre comes out of, pagan mythology infused with medieval Christian morality. But, and that amounts to really dark things. That's why we called it the Dark Ages.
Surprise, the past sucked.
Yeah, but D&D and, women doing anything but bearing children and,
Being
making
persecuted as
food
witches.
and being burnt at the stake. Yeah.
Yeah, but in real life history, there's like 5 examples of women who didn't do that.
Yeah, you could totally find 5 women across 1,000 years that bucked the system and eventually...
I'm exaggerating.
burnt at the stake. No, I'm agreeing.
I'm not looking at you, Jordan.
Yeah, it's me. He's looking at me.
You are, yes. Unfortunately, Jordan was in the line of sight when I was looking at you.
That might also be a reason why I lean towards sci-fi, is that with this idea that you can be anything, do anything, become anything, whatever, once the veil is lifted and you know the truth.
Kyle, I find it really interesting that you have just held onto this claim that sci-fi is great because science is the great equalizer. Like, that's basically what you've been saying. Magic exists as an equalizer in fantasy as well.
But anybody has access to science.
Magic is almost, in everything I've ever read, magic is either unattainable by everyone or requires such rigid study that only an elite few can devote themselves to it, much like what passed for science in the Middle Ages.
Okay. Magic makes you special. Science makes you like everybody else. And I know that's really mean, but I think it's true.
I know I'm not special.
No, my God,
That's
stop!
why
No,
I
you're
prefer
perfect.
sci-fi.
Yeah.
Because I know I can acquire these things.
But whereas I'm just a fairy changeling and I know it, so...
I'm in that boat.
Well, why aren't we making deals?
Because changelings always have to keep
Well,
their
you
promises,
already
and I
owe,
don't know if
you already owe me a favor, so...
Hmm.
That's unfortunate for you, isn't it?
So what is required for something to be fantasy?
I'm gonna say magic. Like some type of hand-waving ability of, oh, this exists because of magic, like Jordan was saying.
Something
Or at least something
supernatural.
mystified.
Not not one word. It's something that is supernatural.
I think it's kind of interesting how in modern fantasy stuff, and now by modern I really mean like 20th century stuff, our idea of what magic is has changed a lot from what it was for every century prior when we had such a concept. Because before, it was religion. It was some kind of religion. And, witchcraft was whatever the religion of the non-dominant people was. And in modern fantasy, it's more like superpowers. It's more like the X-Men, and you can just learn some more superpowers. But, in every fantasy thing prior to that, it's always appealing to spirits and, praying to pagan gods and this and that and the other, sacrificing and what have you. And there really wasn't a distinction between getting your power from a deity and just, waving your fingers and making something happen. All the medieval demon summoning stuff, it looks a lot like D&D with weird runes and whatever kind of thing, but you're still trying to channel some supernatural thing.
Well, as you know, D&D comes from witches. It's from Satan, as we all know. I definitely think that the element of mysticism and something that's supernatural is important to the world. I also think that to have something to be fantasy, there has to be an element of, not like otherworldliness, but there has to be something that very clearly differentiates everyday from not everyday. In playwriting, there's a technique about the why today, and it's supposed to everything's normal, but you're only focusing on this story for this amount of time because today is different. And I think to have a fantasy setting, there needs to be that level of why today in almost everything, whether that is magic, the creation of characters questing, while not necessary, often is one of the biggest tropes in fantasy to have a character or a group of people go on a quest as something that they have to complete. I feel like to have a successful fantasy world, campaign, or story, there always needs to be an element of why today.
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Why today is in Johnny Farmer Boy plowing the fields, goes home and sleeps. That's boring. The why today is Johnny Boy goes out into the field, star falls, and all of a sudden he has magical powers.
I think that's just a story thing. You can write a boring sci-fi story.
I do think, although I more agree with Nina, the concept of I'm going to tell a story about a police officer, a very run-of-the-mill police officer, in the year 2090. Like, yes, there needs to be an element of interest in every story, but it could be a lot more fascinating to show how this police officer solves crimes, investigates, communicates, travels, and that might be enough so that a seemingly pretty mundane thing, Johnny Farmer Boy gets up and goes to bed, could be bashed together as an interesting story in sci-fi, but is perhaps, I would even maybe say, definitely less interesting in fantasy.
I would like to rephrase this in, like, in fantasy, there's always a chosen one. There's always somebody who has to do the thing.
Yeah.
Frodo needs to get the ring.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like Buttercup needs to be rescued so she can marry Wesley. Just, like, there's so many, like, when it comes to fantasy, there always has to be somebody that sets them apart from everybody else. Like, their why today is greater focused.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna stick with my thing that's just a story thing.
I'm gonna stick with this. But,
Like, the protagonist is always special in every single story.
I don't know. There's a lot of unspecial people.
The Expanse. Who's special in that?
Right, that's a good example.
Okay.
Fantasy,
You're right.
fantasy is definitely much more married to the monomyth. The hero's journey is at the core of every fantasy thing I can think of. Yeah, not to belabor it, but sci-fi does tend to be more of a group effort. It's about crews. D&D tries to make it about a crew, but it's not really about a crew.
No.
I see fantasy as the impetus of the adventure being something that is sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, the hand of God coming down and selecting somebody for a great task. Whereas in sci-fi, it's more some extraordinary shit happens to an ordinary person and they have to rise to the occasion.
I think that's really wise.
So, is this something that could be a fantasy exclusive thing? The concept of the ignorant masses.
No, dystopia always
But
is against that because
does
there's
dystopia have to be sci-fi? Future topic. We'll talk about it then.
No, but there are sci-fi dystopias. So, it's not a specifically fantasy thing.
No, I think it was asking is a specifically sci-fi thing.
Or,
No, I said it was asking if it was a fantasy thing.
Oh, okay.
I don't think you could have an actual fantasy world that is like well thought out in the consequences of the things that it's introducing into human civilization without it being a dystopia.
Well, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. I can't think of a single fantasy story that doesn't have the ignorant masses. I can think of several sci-fi stories that don't have that exact concept. May not be exclusive, but perhaps it's commonplace.
for everything that we're saying, there is always some subgenre that turns that on its head. That's why subgenres exist.
I think it might be the reason for that might be calling back to where stories of magic came from, i.e. the pagans, the people that weren't like in the main religion. Like magic has always been seen as a secretive and outsider thing. So that might be why the ignorant masses exist in a lot of fantasy.
So magic was invented by hipsters.
No.
Invented by the persecuted.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you know, the uninvolved masses, they're so mainstream, they don't know what's really going on.
That's not what I mean.
Well, even with the mainline religion, you know, in the Middle Ages, only the priesthood could and the educated elite could read Latin, and so, you know, the religion itself, the actual text was technically occult to everyone who followed it.
You tried to read that Bible and interpret it your own way, you're burned to the cross.
Yeah.
Or just schism the Catholic Church.
I know I had mentioned it jokingly before, but I said elves, and as a joke, but in reality I think there's some level of non-humanism and I think that could also translate into sci-fi, but specifically for fantasy, there's like, there's always elves, dwarves, dragons, something other than humanity. And I guess that can fall under the category of supernatural. But, you tell me a great fantasy storyline that doesn't have something of, like, otherness. Even in Game of Thrones, where everyone's technically human, you have, like, Daenerys, who's, like, a freaking dragon mom, and we got Tyrion. And
Tyrion's just a human.
Yeah, I know, the Red Priestesses gave birth to Shadow Baby. There's just some level of otherness that exists.
I definitely agree with that, especially, and to the point where sci-fi that has aliens, I consider that as a fantasy element.
Yeah.
Because until it's proven otherwise to me, aliens will always be fantasy.
Let me tell y'all
the
about the
truth is
Drake
out there.
equation.
The truth is out there, Clayton.
You went for the Drake equation. I was just like, disclosure, where is it?
What is
about
the
the
Drake
Fermi
equation?
paradox?
No, this is actually really... What is it?
The Drake equation is essentially a way to quantify the probability that in a universe as large as ours, with as many stars that it has, as many planets that orbit those stars in the Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold. Basically, it's quantifying the probability that life exists outside of Earth.
What is it? What number?
It depends on the variables.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's a long string of variables that you need to, figure out, and we're only, we are but specks, ignorant specks. In
And
this
most of the
universe.
variables in this equation are just guessed at.
My favorite way.
If we could get back to the fantasy thing.
Sorry. I get distracted by aliens.
I just wanted to say, talking about Game of Thrones versus other fantasy stuff, I'd venture to guess that probably one of the reasons why you find it very relatable is because there is very little aside from humans. Yeah, there's dragons and there's the White Walkers, but they're like a huge deal that's definitely the exception. There's not an island of elves in the mountain range where the dwarves live or anything like that. What's going on is what humans are doing. And I think that the relatability of fantasy is proportional to, or inversely proportional, I guess, to how many other non-human powers there are in the world. Like, Tolkien is just kind of out the window for me as far as that goes. I can't imagine what it's like to be a human living in, Gondor. It's absurd.
Half the things that are encountered are either its own unique thing and not a species, or it represents some species that is somewhere else, and we're plentiful over there, but here I'm the only one.
Why do you think Tolkien has become the staple of fantasy?
Because he was a popular author whenever the baby boomers came into their thing.
The hippies, yeah. They latched onto the Hobbit lifestyle and thought it was great.
And the anti-war messages in it.
Also, it's fun to read, guys. Like,
Yeah, it's all right.
I think it's fun to read, guys.
I'm more of a Robert E. Howard guy myself.
Doesn't surprise me, actually.
Well, that's another example of a fantasy setting where there isn't a whole lot besides humans.
You might be asking what they've written.
Robert E. Howard is
Conan.
he's the author that created Conan, and I mean, in some ways, it's kind of pushing like a historical sci-fi almost, because a lot of the stuff that Conan will encounter are like the equivalent of like Neanderthals, something like that. Like, it doesn't really stretch the imagination too much. It doesn't ask a whole lot of you. There are a few exceptions, but the magic is very, very subtle. Nothing is very over the top for the most part.
Well, wasn't Conan specifically supposed to be taking place in the Hyborian age of Earth?
Yeah.
In what is now Europe, mostly in Europe.
Yeah, he's like some kind of pre-Ice Age lost civilization sort of thing.
A while back, you and I had a cool conversation, Jordan, about a fantasy series that is the antithesis to Conan that you liked a lot.
Michael Moorcock, the Elric saga, Elric of Melniboné.
Why is it the antithesis? Talk about it a little bit.
Okay, so where Conan is very much the Ubermensch, big muscular guy, kind of dumb, but gets through by force of will.
I disagree with Howard's Conan being dumb.
He's somewhat clever, he's got the thief background and those sorts of skills and stuff, but he definitely looks down his nose at scholars and learning quite a bit. He's about physical power. So in Elric, the title character, Elric, is the complete inverse. He's something like an elf. Melniboneans are very elf-like, but he's anemic. He's an albino. He lays around studying sorcery all the time, and it isn't until he finds a sword that is possessed by a demon, or is a demon, called Stormbringer, that he actually goes out in the world and does a whole lot of hack and slash kind of stuff. But that world is also fairly low magic, but there's a lot more of it than in Hyboria. But it is an interesting example of a modern fantasy, fairly modern fantasy, that does go back to the actual historical roots of magic, where all of the sorcery that's done is summoning an elemental or a demon or something like that and making some kind of bargain with them, often binding them to some item to imbue that item with power, or just having them go off and do something for you, rather than throw a fireball. That never happens in that world. But it's also mostly humans.
You brought up basically anti-fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
Fantasy?
Something that goes out of its way to subvert known tropes. One of my favorite Dungeons and Dragons campaign settings does this, and that is Dark Sun. It has the elves, the halflings, the dwarves, but they're not the Tolkien versions of these races that we all know and love. These are much darker versions that I have come to love, such as the halflings are a bunch of, they're pygmy cannibals. They are the oldest of the intelligent species in the world. They were the first creation, or the first sentient creation. Elves are just they're gypsies. They're lazy. I'm not making racial statements here. I'm just saying what they represent in this world. They're connivers. They're hucksters. And in this Dungeons and Dragons world, magic is almost all just absolutely evil. There are very vanishingly few good sources of magic. The druids are probably the biggest one, and magic itself that traditional wizards would use is broken down into defiling magic that destroys the environment around them versus preserving magic, which it still damages the world, but the spellcasters only take as much magic as they need in order to actually cast a spell. They're trying to harm the world as little as possible when they cast
clean
their
coal.
magic.
Can we play that? That sounds really messed up.
I don't want to play Dark Sun.
You don't.
No.
Dark Sun.
What if it was Light Sun?
Is there a reason you
It
don't want
was
to play
the
Dark Sun?
moons.
I don't like the evil magic stuff. I've tried to play a Dark Sun game in Wargamers, and I just didn't enjoy it.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Have you guys ever heard of the Midnight setting? It was for 3rd edition, maybe 3.5. I can't remember when it came out. But it was also similar to Dark Sun in that the basic premise is that the big evil god kind of won the war, and the orcs and all the evil races just sort of blitzkrieged over the human and elf lands, and everybody's pretty much a slave. It's spelled out pretty clearly that even if you try to do some resistance thing, you're eventually going to get crushed. You're not even allowed to have weapons. It's just complete occupation D&D, and it's
That's
Do
extremely
you
bleak.
typically play the occupiers?
No.
Oh, okay.
Well, when I played, we always played the normal races, trying to fight the power, but it's hopeless.
No, let's do
Yeah,
it. I want to have my hopes and dreams crushed.
I had heard it described as, imagine if Sauron had won. in Lord of the Rings.
So confession, every game you're going to say, or any type of thing, I'm going to say I want to play it, and I love it. They're all just really interesting. I think fantasy is so alluring, because it's so different from what we deal with. And it's escapism. And I think bringing back to tropes that fantasy needs to have, there needs to be some reason why we want to go to this world. Whether it's dystopian or not, there has to be some reason we want to explore it and have characters explore it. There has to be at least some sort of escapist level to it, at least in my belief.
When I was a kid, one of my big fantasies was being able to grab a backpack full of supplies, some nice rugged clothes and hiking boots, and my .22 rifle with about 500 rounds of ammo, and being transported into the Lord of the Rings world.
And live like a god.
Yeah. And specifically, I used to be like, man, what if they just drop me into Helm's Deep? You know, I'll plank all day long. 500 rounds worth. I think escapism can exist in any genre, but I do think that it's very common in fantasy.
I was thinking just now about the time periods that modern medieval fantasy fiction arose out of, which is early 20th century for the most part, versus the modern day fantasy like Dresden Files and all that kind of stuff that you were talking about. That, so far as I'm aware, as a child of round about the 80s, 90s, I can't really think of too many examples from the 70s that would be that sort of thing. It's relatively recent, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've read interviews and heard lots of people belabor the point about how Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and stuff like that are kind of a response to the moral ambiguity of World War I in the early 20th century, and, you know, all that, trying to resuscitate some idea of good versus evil. I wonder how much of the modern fantasy stuff from the 80s and 90s is not exactly from that same kind of place, but if it's more of a disillusionment with, you know, the technological world that we live in, that's very, like, black and white, here's how things are, it's, you know, rational, it's cold, it's corporate, it's stuff that I think cyberpunk sort of tries to run headlong at and deal with the problems, terrible as they are, kind of directly, but that stuff, the modern fantasy stuff, seems to me like it's living in denial is not the word that I want to use here, but that's just the one that came to mind. But it just a rejection of that wholesale. Does that seem fair to you guys? That
I feel like you just described, without actually saying it, the entire world of darkness philosophy.
What do you mean?
Considering the time when it came, when it first started getting published, it was very urban fantasy, but it was definitely just so dark and just hopeless in a lot of ways. And you're in the modern world, but you still got all of these, specifically in Vampire, like these established power structures that are immortal. They are unchanging, despite the fact that the times they are a-changing. But essentially the new blood coming in, the stories are how that change, how in Vampire the fledglings, the fledglings are able to, throughout the series, into like the planned meta plot, how they basically rise into their own.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just seeing it as a parallel to what you were describing for the intent of, like, William Gibson and other dystopia sci-fi authors were doing.
I think calling it a rejection is fair, Jordan. It's this idea that you don't want to deal or participate in this technological corporate world of interconnectivity that we're creating. Well, guess what? There's a world of fae folk and a bunch of vampire covens, and you can be a werewolf. I mean, I guess escapism is too simple, but I think the way you described it's fairly accurate. Seems that way to me anyway.
I enjoy the way you use words.
What do you think, Nina? You're a big urban fantasy fan? What's the socioeconomic impetus of urban fantasy?
I'm just thinking of American Gods. Because I think it really marries the whole modern day problems. Like all of have you read American Gods?
I couldn't get through it.
Wow.
No, I completely understand that because it took me a bit. It's got some boring parts, my guy.
It does.
But did you ever get to the part with the new gods?
I can't remember. It's like 10 years ago.
The new gods are like technology and celebrity and stuff like that, and like things that are like currently plaguing, particularly the
Which
United
one is
States.
David Bowie?
Money. One of them is just money. You're right. What?
Was it one of the gods, David Bowie?
No.
Oh.
No.
Are you sure?
No, it's not David Bowie. That's media.
Media.
Who can take on the form of whichever celebrity media wants.
Which David Bowie could also do.
Just your local weather woman. But yeah, that was the only thing that came to my mind that didn't fit into what you were saying. I was just thinking of Neil Gaiman's other books, which...
Neverwhere.
Yeah, that's still sitting on my shelf. Didn't never finish it.
Urban fantasy, right? Neverwhere's urban fantasy.
Yeah. I should
Neil
return that
Gaiman's like
book.
the king of that stuff. Urban fantasy.
Does anybody have any other fantasy series that they really enjoy or campaign settings or anything that they want to maybe bring up or recommend?
No.
Okay. Shut me down.
Nah, I was just thinking about it when you're bringing up Vampire and World of Darkness, because World of Darkness is hands down my favorite, whether it's Old World or New World. I think it has such an interesting mythos of pulling from things that exist and adding this level of just like things that happen and causality. Like in Vampire the Masquerade, the different like levels of how far you are from Cain, and I've just been really, really into it because I'm running a vampire campaign, and just, I think it's interesting level of fantasy, because when I think about World of Darkness, I don't instantly think fantasy. Then again, I don't really think a lot of things instantly, but I just think it's a really cool world as a basis of entering urban fantasy, and then getting more into things like the Dresden Files, more Neil Gaiman's work, and then, of course, you have to find the type of fantasy that fits you in the end. Like, whether that's extremely high fantasy, low fantasy, urban fantasy, no fantasy. You can do sci-fi. Find the type of fantasy that fits you. Because in reality, isn't it all just one big fantasy?
No.
Fuck you. I had a beautiful, loving quote that could have just put a pin in it.
It's false.
Okay, but anybody else have anything they'd like to recommend to our listeners?
I would like to say why I think Elric and Melniboné is a really interesting fantasy setting. It's because it, along with a lot of the other things that it throws out the window as far as normal tropes, it completely gets rid of the static good versus evil cosmology of every other fantasy that came before it that I can think of. Its cosmology is all about law and chaos, and there's a lot of plane hopping in those stories, and you get to see a lot of different worlds where the balance between those two forces is drastically one way or the other, and gradations in between. And you go to worlds that are completely run by chaos, and it's like everything is lava and fire and crazy things and demonic shit everywhere. But then they go to places that are run by law, and everything is literally frozen. Nobody does anything. Everyone is just like a statue stuck in place. And the places that are really doing the best are the places that have an even balance of the two. And in some worlds, the horrible forces are chaos. In some worlds, the horrible forces are law. And the same character is switching allegiances back and forth based on the context that they find themselves in. And I think that is much more interesting storytelling than there's the dragon, let's go stab it, because that's the good thing to do.
Since I was probably about 10 years old, my favorite type of fantasy, I read a whole bunch of it, and then just within the past 20 years, there's been this just absolute renaissance as far as movies being able to portray it in a way that movies have the special effects to show it, and also they're actually bringing about the stories in this fantasy that we are right now just in the midst of something that if I had known that this was going to be happening when I was 13, I would have, my head would have exploded, is just the ubiquity of comic book movies now, where comic books are every bit of urban fantasy taken in a very different direction than what we've all been talking about here. But that's been my main source of, I would consider, urban fantasy, even though a lot of people probably wouldn't immediately think of that as urban fantasy, but I can't think of anything that urban fantasy has that the superhero movies and comic books don't have.
Sure, it's modern day paganism.
I hadn't thought of it that way. Like, what I know about Spider-Man. Pretty cool urban fantasy, you know? Dude gets powers, has to live his life still as a student / pizza delivery guy. Does he deliver pizza?
Sometimes.
He's a photographer.
Sometimes.
Get me pictures of Spider-Man.
And his first appearance was in Amazing Fantasy 15.
Well.
I knew that. Yeah. Book-wise, I'd recommend Watership Down because it's basically a modern fairy tale. Mm-hmm. And also, it's just real creepy, my guys.
Have you seen the animated?
Yes. I actually saw it before I read the book, and I love it so much.
My teacher mistakenly showed it to us in 3rd grade.
Oh. God, how did you watch the entire thing, or because there's that first scene of like rabbit death, and then you're like,
I don't know. All I remember are just animated rabbits covered in blood.
And like that sounds kind of funny, but
what color's rabbit blood?
It's so what?
What color's rabbit blood?
Red, like yours.
Okay.
But it's a good movie, a really good book. Highly recommend.
To answer my own question, any fans of the Dresden Files? I've only read a couple books in this series, but I would recommend Charlie Huston's series of modern fantasy vampire detective stories. They're film noir detective. He's a vampire. Surprise. They're very cool. Just really neat elements of like past 30 to 40 years of history. Vampires being born in that time period. You know, I want to say the main character became a vampire when a rich asshole like solicited him for a blowjob in the bathroom at CBGB and then bit him and turned him into a vampire.
On the dick?
I don't know where.
Sorry. Okay, continue.
Probably not, no.
But predictably, I'm going to recommend to our listeners, highly, highly recommend one of my favorite series that I've read. Could be fantasy. Fantasy readers would enjoy it. It is Sean McMullen's Souls in the Great Machine. There's several books in the series. That's the title of the first one. And it is far, far post-apocalypse, where kind of eclipse phasey sci-fi apocalypse has happened. AI gone nuts, World War III or IV at this point. World is plunged into awfulness, and people revert all the way back to early feudal states. And there are a few characters who see these wandering stars in the sky and attempt to communicate with what is commonly believed to be gods. There's also a strange facet where anytime someone tries to develop an internal combustion engine or any type of wireless communication, and actually, also telegraph lines, stuff just melts. And so a lot of steampunk, a lot of human-powered things. Long-distance communication is achieved with these tall towers with magnesium flash pans and mirrors, so you can, like, signal tower each other. But there are a few characters who are within the elite of society who have the freedom to study the gods and the religion. And I'll leave it up to the reader. But, really cool series.
I think we've done a pretty good job of covering the history of fantasy stuff, but I'm curious what you guys think about the future of fantasy stuff, because for me personally, I love to be a downer. I'm kind of tired of it because I think it's been so overdone. Game of Thrones is the last one that really breathed some fresh air into the fantasy genre for me in popular media, but I don't know how much more that old horse has got left in it.
I don't know. I feel like there's always going to be people that need and enjoy fantasy. There's always going to be people who like the escapism of dragons and elves and Tolkienistic, that's a new word, Tolkienistic adventures. But while I do feel like there's a lot of cliches, and I'm very intrigued as to see where the genre can go from here, I don't think it's ever going to be something that we're going to get bored of as a mass rather than individual. I mean, fantasy can go anywhere for a person, but I think it's fad. It follows the fad trend of like vampires were in. Then it was zombies. You know, in a few years it's gonna be back to like fantasy party, elves, dwarves, humans. You know, so I feel like it's gonna continuously follow that path. And what I would like to see from fantasy is the breaking down, like establish a cliche and then completely revert it or break it down. I know that the oh god damn it, the fucking movie thing. I'm gonna say the wrong thing and then you're all gonna yell at me. Okay.
I can edit.
What is it?
Okay, so it was the World of Warcraft movie, I think, and they tried to reinvert the idea of like pious orcs or like noble orcs in the sense of like the main character is somebody from this very established like aggressive tribe, and then revert it on its head. It's like, oh, but they're noble. Oh, he really wants to try something new. So, I know you're... See, I told you, I already made a mistake.
No, you didn't make a mistake. I'm asking a question.
Okay.
How much of a downer am I if I say that 180ing cliches has become a cliche of itself?
Yeah.
It's happening constantly.
But you know what?
People should just stop writing. We're out of ideas.
Well, to be fair, there are no new ideas. There are no new ideas.
No,
but I'm a writer, so please don't tell me that.
The specific thing I'm talking about is presenting this like, this is going to be very cliched, this is the story, and then being like, oh, no it's not, I'm flipping it, like...
Shrek kind of broke it. Shrek broke it.
I haven't seen the World of Warcraft movie for obvious reasons, but in that movie was it the setup that most of the orcs were aggressive assholes and there was like one good one in the pack?
Yeah, that's
He was
not...
like the house orc or something?
Yes.
No.
Okay. That's...
Well...
Yeah. Am I wrong?
No. Thrall was not in this one.
Help him.
So, as terrible as the movie was, it did follow very, very well the actual lore of Warcraft.
Okay.
Was the newest movie the one with like the half-orc girl that was like just real sexy?
Garona.
Yeah, had the tiny little things.
She was in the first Warcraft game.
Was she? See, I don't know anything about World War. I'm just curious.
I feel like it's pointless to try to predict where a genre is going to go. It's so unpredictable.
True, but
You can have a wish list.
No.
Not allowed.
Hayley, your idea that there's always going to be people who want classic lowercase c fantasy. I see a lot of fantasy still becoming mainstream popular through the young adult avenue. Harry Potter being a big one. Game of Thrones is not young adult, but certainly an example that isn't, that became huge here recently. But what about oh god, I haven't read any of these, but his Dark Materials, or like Maximum Ride, or these other...
The Magicians.
Okay.
That's a big one right now.
I don't know much about young adult, but I've seen it become popular, and then I've seen movies. Maybe young adult is just popular now, but I've seen it become a cross-media franchise.
Fantasy has always been young adult. Going back to Tolkien, the hippies in high school and going to college and reading Tolkien, and then everything that has come since, it's been on a wave of stuff that was popular with the kids these days, and then just grew into what we now know as the established genres that we can't imagine what's going to come next because everything's already been done.
Also, young adult will always be popular because there will always be young adults.
Yep.
And they're the group of people that read the most.
Well, I don't know. I might be just dumb and optimistic, but I think we're doing a lot of cool stuff in our Abena fantasy campaign. I mean, I know it follows some...
Pushing any boundaries?
You're a spider wolf! You're a spider spider wolf.
I don't know if that's pushing, like,
That's a
Everything I do is recycled from something.
The Zephyra are a wholly unique creation of me that I've never
I don't know. I'm really optimistic, you guys. I have hopes and dreams for fantasy. I think we could do it.
Jordan, you touched on something that I want to take a little bit further. Whenever you mentioned about Neverwhere and not being able to read it.
American Gods is the one.
Or American Gods. Sorry, American Gods. I'm sure we all have it, and I have mine sitting in front of me, like to remind me of what it is. Is there anything that you can think of that is the worst thing that you have read, but it has been such a profound influence on the way you view a genre?
Guys, Vampire Academy.
Yes.
Because personally, it is Perdido Street Station. I absolutely hated that novel.
What is
I
it?
hated everything about that novel. But there was so much in it that was good.
What do you mean by that?
Okay, no shit. You can read the first 50 pages and then skip to page probably 300, 350 and not miss a goddamn thing as far as the plot of this story.
Oh.
It is entirely just world building that the author is doing for 200 plus pages. And it is a slog to go through. It is like reading the part of The Hunchback of Notre Dame where Dumas is describing the streets of Paris. And it just goes on and on and on. But it has helped my ability to be a game master and like describe things that are going on in the worlds, like giving me the granularity in the sessions to tell you what you're all experiencing, and I feel like I'm giving an inkling of what I've got going on in my head. But that's my recommendation. I hate that I read it. I hate that I forced myself through because it was a slog. Every page was a slog to get through, but it has so much good material for me as a game master.
For me, it was Vampire Academy, because I read it when I was the demographic for it when I was a young teen, and there's every aspect about it on its own is very good. There's the boarding school for these like not magic, but they're vampires. And, like, there's the ruling families and, like, scandal and stuff like that. And, like, the lore behind the vampires is really interesting and rooted in, like, actual lore in the real world for vampires. But I would never recommend you read it because there's just no substance there. And I don't mean that in, this is a book for young teens, don't read it, because I'd never say something like that. But even as, like, a 13-year-old girl, I was like, there's nothing happening. It's not fun to read, but I got through 3 of them in one day. But there's, like, everything solely, like, every aspect alone is so good, and I don't know what happened when she put them all together. So don't read it. Not a recommendation.
I know this is going to sound extremely dumb and stupid, and
I just
Haley,
talked about
stop.
Vampire Academy.
No,
Are you
I don't think
kidding
you
me?
understand.
Stop prefacing things you say and just say them.
Okay.
We're going to listen and we're going to talk about it.
I read a lot of really bad fan fiction because it helps me.
It's fine.
Specifically, like, My Immortal kind of bad, because I like to see where someone can like, this is something I want to put in the world.
My Immortal's a piece of art. I don't know what you're talking about.
They believe in it so thoroughly, and they 100% go for an extreme. And I feel like when I read other people do that, it's like, okay, that means I can do that with something. So, for example, if a player wants to do like something really extreme and absurd, like, you know what? Why the fuck not? It helps me have the confidence to do things in urban fantasy-esque things. And also just as a human being, knowing that other people are okay with trying things that are definitely failing. It just makes me happy on the inside. And it inspires me a lot.
My Immortal, that masturbatory Harry Potter, like...
Yes,
writing-
Ebony
Darkness, Dementia, Raven Way.
NOB.
It's Ebony for most of it. It's literally Ebony for most of it, and she misspelled it once, and y'all were like, meme! Am I defending it? No.
I've read all 43 chapters.
I am certain that My Immortal is meta art.
Me too. Thank you.
Here's the thing. I know too much about My Immortal. I know the true story behind it. I almost made like a little mockumentary about it. Basically, there's this girl.
Have you spoken to this?
You spoken to them?
Have you spoken with them? Because I'm just going off of what I'm reading, and this seems like meta art to me.
Okay, so here's the thing. There's 2 authors. Halfway through it becomes meta art. This is from my history lodging of their original Tumblr posts, and I like following their original account while it's coming out and getting the backstory behind it, but also reading all of the author notes. I know I'm not convincing you. This is my conspiracy that I feel like is true to my bone, because I've read all of their archives of like their... It's just really good. I'll tell you later. It's a real crackpot theory. I'll like break out my photo board, my string. Like, I'm convinced I know the true story. It's so good. But back on track. Somebody else talk about something, please.
I really hate to throw this book series under the bus for this because it was so influential on me when I was a kid. The Dragonlance Chronicles. I read these when I was... I read that trilogy in the mid-90s, kind of before anybody even had a word for YA fiction. And it was, for those who don't know, it was the novelization of an actual Dungeons & Dragons game that some TSR employees who were working out this new world just decided to, commit to novel form. I don't think I would have fully understood how to do Dungeons and Dragons if I hadn't read this book, these books, and I read many of the books in the series and loved them when I was a kid, but I wouldn't suggest them to anybody over about 16 years old at this point. If you're past that, you've probably missed the boat. I went back a couple years ago and tried to read them again, and as much as I love Margaret Wise and Tracy Hickman, I just couldn't do it. It's a great setting. I really love the Dragonlance world. I really love all those characters, but it's YA fiction, and I've definitely outgrown it at this point. But yeah, it showed me what that kind of thing is supposed to be about.
Yeah, I read the first published novel when I was 19, and I was too old.
Yeah.
He is too old. I cannot train him. I misunderstood your question at first, Clayton. This book did not have an influence on me in terms of how to better do an RPG, but I think it's... let it be a warning, maybe an example of what not to read and how not to do things. People have always recommended, or had always recommended, R.A. Salvatore to me. It's Salvatore or Salvatore?
I think it's Salvatore.
Yeah.
Okay.
Rob.
People had always recommended R.A. Salvatore to me, and I bought some at a used bookstore. There was one called The Woods Out Back. Anybody? It's a one-off. I didn't want to get started in any other drizzes or anything like that. And the back of it talks about this mid-20-something dude bored with his job, goes for a walk in the woods, and winds up in a fantasy setting. And I was like, what? That old chestnut. And it's awful! Very rarely do I ever put down a book in disgust and stop reading it. But this book starts out with the most mundane, stereotypical description of your average, just like, what's that? You're not happy with your life? You have a bad job you work and hate? Boy, I bet you can relate to this guy whose name is like Greg or Gary or something. And he goes for a walk in the woods, just like the damn back of the book said, and suddenly ends up in the most mundane, average, nothing original fantasy world you can possibly imagine. There are elves and dwarves and mountain fortresses. It's fucking terrible.
Did he encounter a strong man with corded muscles?
I think so. Sounds about right.
If I'm not mistaken, this is the same son of a bitch that killed Chewbacca.
Yep.
Wait, what?
He
dropped a moon on him.
Yeah, he was writing the Yuzan Vong books back before they completely wiped the whole expanded universe of Star Wars.
Ripperoni.
He was the guy who had the big idea to crush Chewbacca with a moon.
I know podcast you can't see my face, but it looks like you just told me a puppy died. That's really sad.
Don't worry.
I'm glad it's not canon.
It didn't happen. Disney cured it all for us.
But there's so
Thanks,
much that we
Disney.
lost, Disney.
Sarcasm meter. It's flashing.
Chewbacca could have taken a moon.
No.
Yeah, earlier you said something about how we always we're always going to want some fantasy or need some fantasy or something like that it'll never go away. And assuming, and to me this is true, that there is a difference between fantasy, mundane fiction, and sci-fi, what is it that is special about fantasy, exclusive to fantasy, that offers something that we need psychologically that would cause it to perpetuate essentially forever? What can you find there that is not to be found elsewhere?
A desire for something that cannot be explained.
Humans are fascinated by magic. Even, like, before we had, like, the superpower-esque magic. Like, there were people that were fascinated by, like, the pagans, even though it was, like, wrong. Mm-hmm. I just think it's a fascinating concept.
I think everybody is all right, you know? Mm-hmm. Magic is something that we've always wanted to obtain. It's in everything. Sorry, I was talking away from the microphone. Magic is really... Oh, fuck you. Magic is cool. It is good. It's seen through all sorts of types of history. And I think it's very true that the element of something that we can't explain. And I think that mystery, that fantasy is what we're always trying to strive after. It's the reason it'll never go stale in our mouths.
It's something that has always existed, and something that has been that central to the human experience. I can't see it just fading away, even in stagnation. Something's going to happen. Something's going to change. Even to the point where, well, just looking at how fantasy has changed in the past 100 years, we've had the rise of taking something that was very recent and completely spinning it into a fantasy genre like steampunk. I think that here in maybe 30 years, we're going to have some sort of fantasy version of what we are living now. The rise of like social media and the ubiquity of the or just the coming of the age of technology, or the age of technology assisted communication, is going to find its way somehow into some future fantasies genre that we can't even fathom right now.
Fantasy story about a society with a collective hive mind would be interesting. Like, you have individual personalities, but you're all always connected somehow.
Wouldn't that
just through magic?
Yeah, no, totally.
Do you think that as time goes on, though now most of our fantasy stuff takes place in something roughly analogous to, say, 800 years ago or something like that, do you think as time goes on, fantasy is going to follow us historically at roughly the same delayed interval, or do you think that the medieval fantasy is always going to be a thing? Is there something special about that kind of civilization that we want to
preserve,
live within in limited ways?
I think to some degree it already has.
Nobility and the class system and the noble knights and things like that are always going to be a thing that people think is endearing.
I don't know, I think it's a mixture of both.
Even in the Middle Ages, when the Arthurian legends came about during that period of time, and even then they were looking back on this great time that happened before, approximately like 400 to 800 years before, where everything was so much different and so much more fantastic than the mundanity of now. Yeah, I think that in the future it's going to continue where, considering how our society is growing, I think it's going to continually get to the point where the gap between something that is looked back fondly and romanticized is going to get shorter and shorter and shorter. Just like how now we're to the point where we're like looking back and creating fantasies about things that happened in the 80s and 90s. Now in the
Scott Pilgrim.
Yep.
I had not considered that. That's a really good point. Hell, even That 70s Show.
Oh, yeah.
Wow, That 70s Show is fantasy.
Oh,
new title.
A concept.
Oh, even Happy Days, made in the 70s, based in the 50s.
Fantasy never dies.
Though I'm not arguing that Happy Days or That 70s Show are fantasy.
I don't know, that dream episode...
Mork from Ork debuted in...
Mork and Mindy.
Happy.
That was the actual name of it.
No, I'm talking the character Mork from Ork.
No.
Showed up in
The
Happy
show
Days
Mork...
first.
What? Really?
Yeah.
Mork was from Happy Days?
Yeah.
Shut up!
Yeah.
Cool, I'm gonna have to find that
I mean,
episode.
he did jump a shark. Huh.
Yeah.
Wow.
The Fonz had the magic of getting the jukebox to go. Right.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, even in Saved by the Bell, they had that power where they could stop time and talk about things. The urban fantasy of that.
I love this discussion. This is my favorite thing. I'm sorry. Like, very low fantasy that is still fantasy, i.e. the magic of getting a jukebox to work, or somebody that can just always make the perfect pie or something like that. I consider that, like, an aspect of fantasy, but, like, lowest tier. It's still magic.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think it says about us that we keep looking back at history and very much cherry-picking the stuff that we want to inhabit about it?
I think it's just human nature of us being really shitty. We always want the best parts and none of the pits.
I think it's part of it is when we were kids, we were actually there. Mm-hmm. But when you're a kid, you're not really experiencing the world. Mm-hmm. You're only remembering either the good times or something that was so god awful, but wasn't bad enough for you to repress the memory. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a lot of, like, nostalgia itself just paints rose-colored glasses over everything that happened before.
I wonder how far that goes. I mean, because we sort of see it as I think about some fantasy stuff, like Deadlands, for example. I would call that somewhat of a fantasy setting. It's sort of steampunky in ways, but there's definitely magic in it. But it's also sort of cherry-picking history. Like, that is an age of genocide and slavery and atrocity, but that's not what's going on in that game. So, I don't know, the whole enterprise sounds like it's very much built on denial to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is very obviously going to be the first in a mini-part series that we do. I had intended for this to be just we would talk about some aspects of medieval fantasy today, and then we would kind of tackle different subgenres. But we've barely even scratched the surface of medieval fantasy. So this in and of itself,
good overarching fantasy discussion, though.
Yes, but this in and of itself is probably going to be the start in a series specifically about medieval fantasy. So with that, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
The dice are
Now grab your D10s and your morality scales. All the times they are changing.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons Attribution No Derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.